Hey friends, so in this video I'm going to talk about Matthew chapter 28 verses 1 through 10, which is the gospel reading for Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday, in the lectionary in year A. So you'll notice that in the text over here I've highlighted different things, and those are some things I wanted to highlight that are unique to the Gospel of Matthew in the telling of this resurrection narrative. Of course, as with some of the other passages that we've looked at from the Synoptic Gospels, like last week for Palm Sunday, for example, and Jesus' triumphal entry, the big picture point, the Gospels agree on, right? That Jesus is resurrected and that's world-changing, life-changing. So I don't want to lose sight of that major point as we look at some of the details. Of course, that is the main idea on this Easter Sunday, is to proclaim Jesus' resurrection and the implications that has for our life and for our world. At the same time, though, there are these little differences, or in the case of Gospel of John, big differences, right? But even among Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are these little differences in the way that each of the synoptic Gospels tells the story. And while we want to keep our eyes focused on that main message of the resurrection and sort of the beginning of the new creation through Jesus' resurrection, I do think it's interesting and worthwhile to look at some of the things that are unique to each of the Gospels. And so I've highlighted those here and want to draw attention to those. And I'll just quickly note, too, because as we start off right away, the passage tells us immediately who it is that's coming to the tomb, right? After the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the tomb. I haven't highlighted this because it's not necessarily unique to Matthew, but what is distinctive in each of the Gospels is they all have a different account of who it is that's coming to the tomb, which women it is that's coming to the tomb to care for Jesus' body. So each Gospel has a different account of who that is, which just raises a bigger question in some ways, or another interesting point is that it can be a really interesting exercise if you have the time, maybe not during Holy Week this week when things are very busy, but it can be a really interesting exercise when you have the time to sit down with the four gospel accounts and to try to actually make one narrative out of them, right? That's not contradictory. And I think that's an interesting exercise, not necessarily because we're trying to get to the history behind these narratives, right? I mean, we have four gospels for a reason, and I think those four accounts are important. So it's not like an attempt to get behind the gospel accounts, but it's a way, for me at least, it's a way of paying attention to the details of each of these accounts, and you start to notice, like, hey, the Gospels each have different women going to the tomb. The Gospels disagree about what they see when they get there, right? How many do they see an angel? Do they see one angel or two angels or a man dressed in white? Or they just think, do they encounter Jesus, right? In the Gospel of Mark, for example, at least if you take the shorter ending, which I consider to be the original ending, they never actually see the resurrected Jesus even. So anyway, all that to say that can be an interesting exercise and a good way to think about the way the Gospels are telling this resurrection story. In this video, I'm not going to focus on all those differences. I'm not going to try and create an account of from all four Gospels. In this video, I just want to focus on what's unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And one of those, so that we get a sort of a flavor of Matthew's way of telling the story, because there are some interesting things that Matthew's doing here. And one of those things is almost right off the bat here in verse 2, right? Matthew says that there was a great earthquake when the women come to the tomb. For an angel from the Lord came down from heaven, coming to the stone, he rolled it away and sat on it. And again, I'll just note, I've highlighted the sat on it here just because, again, what the angels do or how many angels there are, what it is that the women see when they come to the tomb is different in each of the Gospels. And so I've just highlighted that in this case, the angel is sitting on the stone that he rolled away, which is a little different from the other Gospels. I don't think that's of great theological significance, but again, just want to note, that what the women see when they come to the tomb is different in each case. I do think this earthquake is really interesting because that is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. None of the other Gospels mention an earthquake, but more than just that it's distinctive to Matthew, I think Matthew's doing some interesting things with it, right? So if you look here, it connects it back to Jesus' crucifixion. So I've put here Matthew, the end of Matthew 27, which is of course right before this. And right at Jesus' death, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, then he died. Look, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. And then this is super interesting, right? Because it goes on in verse 53 to talk about Jesus' resurrection. Jesus has just died. We haven't, we're still in chapter 27. We haven't gotten the resurrection narrative of chapter 28 yet. But Matthew's sort of already giving away the ending, right? After Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their graves and went into the holy city where they appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and what had just happened, they were filled with awe and said, "This was certainly God's Son." The other Gospels have a tendency to kind of hold the tension of Jesus' death or hold the suspense, But Matthew's just right out with it, right? Jesus has just died, and he's already talking about his resurrection and the things that are going to happen. And so I think this earthquake, it forms what scholars would call an inclusio, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying sort of narrative bookends, right? It's a way of, inclusio. You're including, you're putting sort of bookends on either side of the story. And so I think one thing that this earthquake is doing from a literary perspective is just connecting Jesus' death and resurrection, which again, these verses 53 to 54 are really doing that anyway. I think all the Gospels hold Jesus' death and resurrection together in certain ways to say you can't fully understand the meaning of either one without the other. But Matthew is perhaps doing that in especially strong ways, that he's immediately mentioning the resurrection right after, and then when he's talking about the resurrection, he's sort of pointing you back to the earthquake that happened at Jesus' crucifixion. And so this earthquake is a distinctive Matthean literary device to hold the crucifixion and resurrection together. But I think the earthquake is also doing something else. It's not only pointing us back to Matthew 27, it's also pointing us forward a little bit to what's happening here in just a couple verses. So it goes on to talk about the angel. Now his face was like lightning and his clothes as white as snow. The guards, and remember, like Matthew's already mentioned this, right? Back here in verse 54 when the centurion and those with him who were sorry, that's guarding him at his crucifixion. But what I haven't included here is another piece that is unique to Matthew is that the authorities set up guards at Jesus' tomb because they're worried about someone coming and stealing his body and then saying that he was resurrected because Jesus said that he was going to be resurrected. That also is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. We don't have guards at the tomb in Mark, Luke, and John. And we don't have this whole story about how they pay off the guards and tell them to say that somebody came and stole the body and all those kinds of things, right? So all that material is completely unique to the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not going to get into that a lot in this video since that's not in our particular passage for this week. But all that to say that that's why we have guards at the tomb, right? If you were just looking at this narrative, you'd be like, hey, where did these guards come from? And you have to go back and read the previous chapter to remember, like, oh yeah, Matthew's the only one who tells the story about the guards being at the tomb. The guards who have been placed at the tomb were so terrified of him that they shook with fear. And that's what I want to draw attention to right here and connect it back to this earthquake, right? They shook with fear because in Greek, the language is essentially the same. And so you see I have that right here, that in verse 2, there was a great seismos, right? You kind of hear the word seismology, which is the study of earthquakes, right, where we get that language from. There was a great seismos, there was a great shaking, and then in verse 4, you might not be able to see it necessarily in English, right? Because we say an earthquake and that the guards shook with fear. Of course, we know there's a lot of shaking involved in an earthquake. But in Greek, it's even more obvious because you have a great seismos, and then in verse 4, from fear of them, the ones guarding were shaken. Esthesthesan. And so you can see right here, I mean, again, I know many watching this video probably don't know Greek, but you can see this. Actually, let me do that a little bit differently. I think I'm going to highlight that instead so it's a little bit easier to see. So you see the root here, the sort of size part of the word, that these are the same root word, right? And so the earth is shaken and the guards are also shaken. And so this earthquake is doing sort of a lot of literary work in Matthew because it's pointing us back to Jesus' crucifixion and also pointing us forward to the guards shaking. And I think that's more than just sort of clever wordplay. I actually think it gets a lot at what it is that Matthew is doing in his gospel because ultimately what's happening here is this is a theophany, right? A revelation of God. This is a theophany, what's happening here at the resurrection, sort of calling back to some of the theophanies in the Hebrew Bible, where the earth is shaken, or these sort of marvelous things happen in the cosmos to reveal God's presence. And so this earthquake is also setting up this sort of theophany that, like, hey, pay attention, this natural event is actually pointing us towards something supernatural, that God is at work in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. But it's not just that, it's that people, a theophany can kind of push people in two directions in some ways, right? On the one hand, fear is a common response and even an appropriate response to a theophany in much of the Hebrew Bible, right? If you're encountering the divine, that can be a really scary thing. And so I think that's part of what's going on here. But I also think that there is a sense in which uh, God's revelation in Jesus' resurrection is a sort of visitation, a sort of judgment from the Lord in the Hebrew Bible sense that when God acts, when God shows up, when there's a visitation from God, a judgment from God, whether that's a good thing or not often depends on sort of where you stand in relationship to what's happening, right? So to put it another way, uh, when we think about judgment in our in much of 21st century U.S. culture, that word tends to have sort of a negative connotation, like we don't like the idea of judging. But if you are somebody who is oppressed, then you want the judge to rule, and you hope that the judge rules in your favor, right? If you're a victim, if you're being taken advantage of, then judgment can actually be positive for you if it brings an end to that victimization or oppression. If you are the victimizer or the oppressor, then yeah, you probably don't want judgment, right? And similarly, the prophetic texts in the Hebrew Bible, when they talk about, say, the day of the Lord, for example, like the day of the Lord is coming, that God's going to come and judge the nations. Again, sometimes that's positive and sometimes that's negative. That there are texts that say, like, oh, you're thinking of the day of the Lord as this great day of rescue, but actually it's going to be this day of terrible wrath and judgment. But it really sort of depends on where you stand in relation to what God is doing, right? If, again, if you're being victimized and oppressed, and then the day of the Lord, God showing up, you're looking forward to that because you want God to set things right, to make the creation work the way that it's supposed to. But if you are the victimizer or the oppressor, then yeah, you're probably right to fear the day of the Lord because God showing up is probably not good news for you. And so I think that's a little bit of what's going on in this kind of theophany here, right? That there is a sense in which there's one sense in which the guards being shaken with fear is an appropriate response for anybody. But there is another sense in which, like, yeah, they should be afraid because they're sort of on the wrong side of Jesus' resurrection. And you contrast that with the angel says to the women, don't be afraid, right? And we're going to see that repeated by Jesus again in verse 10. Don't be afraid. And so I think there is a sense in which Jesus' resurrection sort of pushes the guards and the women in two different directions, even as their reactions overlap in some ways, because they are both fearful to some degree. But there is a sense in which it's like, hey, Jesus, God, what God is doing in Jesus' resurrection um, is good news for a whole lot of people, and then maybe not good news for other people. And so I think you see Matthew sort of playing with that language here in the shaking of the earth and the shaking of the guards. But then there's also sort of more that's going on here because it says the guards were so terrified of him that they shook. What the CEB translates as terrified here, you could translate more literally as and from fear of them, sorry, of fear of him. Sorry, I wrote that, translated that wrong. Fear of him, talking about the angel. Um, and so and from fear of him the guards were shaking, right? And so you have uh, fabu is the word fear right here, but then so that's the guards response to the angel is fear of him. But then the angel said to the women, you don't be afraid. And actually, so this is it right here. Let me erase that. Me fabeste humes. Uh, so first of all, I just want to emphasize that this is the same root word, fabu and fabeste, like we are like the English word phobia, right? Is the word for fear. Um, so they're afraid of the angel, but the angel says to the women, you don't be afraid. And actually there is this sort of emphasis with the you, humeis in Greek. I should have actually written that out here in the translation. Because it is, I think, actually meant as a contrast. Because in Greek, you actually don't need this humeis. You don't need to say you. The you is actually encoded in the verb. So if the writer writes out humeis, actually says you, it's probably for emphasis. In fact, you can see down here in verse 10, which is down here, when Jesus says don't be afraid, the humeis is not there. The you is not there because you don't need it. So there's a real emphasis here on, yeah, the guards are shaking out of terror, out of fear, but the angel is saying, but you don't be afraid, right? Like it's an intentional contrast. And he goes on to say, I know that you were looking for Jesus who was crucified. Um, of course, the women do respond with some fear. Uh, Down here in verse 8, um, so all right, so let's read the rest of this, I guess. He says, I know you were looking for Jesus who was crucified. He isn't here because he's been raised from the dead, just as he said. Come see the place where they laid him. Now hurry, go and tell his disciples he's been raised from the dead. He's going on ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. I've given the message to you. And then it is with great fear and excitement, the CEB says, they hurried away from the tomb and ran to tell his disciples. Um, what I want to emphasize here is the kind of parallels that I've laid out in this green box, that uh, the guards respond with fear. The angel tells the women, you don't be afraid. Then in verse 8, we find out, well, actually, they do have some fear, right? So here you see the same word again as up here in verse 4, metaphabu, with fear, but their fear is mixed with great joy. Uh, and then Jesus repeats to them again, don't be afraid, right? So I think there's a sort of movement in this passage of the guards are absolutely terrified. They shake like the earth shakes, and rightfully so. They should be afraid, right? Because they're sort of on the wrong side of this equation, so to speak. The women respond with fear, with some fear, but the angel encourages them and says, no, no, you don't be afraid like the guards are. Well, it doesn't just go away for them, right? They still have some fear mixed with their great joy. Uh, but then Jesus says again to them, don't be afraid, which, by the way, is the most common command in Scripture. Don't be afraid. Uh, and part of the reason it's so common is because it's a common command in precisely these kind of scenarios, these theophanies. When somebody encounters an angel or a messenger of God, they are rightfully, reverently fearful when they first encounter them, and then they're told, "Don't be afraid. It's okay." So there's this sort of movement from fear to joy in this passage, at least for the women. Uh, the guards, on the other hand, who are terrified and who are shaken with fear, they become like dead men. And I think that's another part of the contrast here, which I think is intentionally contrasted with Jesus, who is raised from the dead, right? So they became hos necroi, another word you might recognize some English cognates of, meaning dead, right? So they became like dead ones, but Jesus was raised ton necron, raised from the dead. So I don't think this choice to say that they became like dead men is an accident for Matthew. It seems to me to be an intentional contrast between Jesus being raised from the dead, but his resurrection, let's say, has maybe well, it's life giving for some people and maybe not for others, right? And again, it's about that theophany. It's about that visitation of God. Of course, I, along with anybody, would want to say the gospel is for everyone who's ready to receive it, right? Um, but these guards are sort of representative of Rome, right? I don't think it's really about the guards individually, right? They're just kind of following orders. But they are representative of the empire that is on the wrong side of God's visitation, the wrong side of God's judgment, right? And so I think Matthew has all this wordplay going on here, that is sort of showing the ways that resurrection can push folks in different directions, right? That there is a sense in which we have some choice in how we respond to this good news and whether it's good news or not. So just lots of wordplay going on here. Another interesting thing I mentioned here in verse 8, with great fear and excitement, the CEB translates it, they hurried away from the tomb and ran to tell his disciples. This phrase here is charos megalos, which I would typically translate as great joy. Charos is kind of the typical joy is sort of the typical translation of charos. And what's really hard to see in the way that the CEB translates this is that there's a connection with Jesus' greeting to them in verse 9. The CEB says, but Jesus met them and greeted them. That's just how it translates it. I would translate this more literally as, and behold, Jesus met them saying, rejoice, karete, right here. Let me erase this so you can see it a little bit better. And I'll highlight this. So you see the word karos for joy and kairete. You can hear how those are very similar, have a similar root. So yes, kairete is a greeting. Jesus does greet them, but I think the translation covers up that it's not just that they have excitement and Jesus greets them. It's they have this mixture of fear and great joy, and Jesus greets them and basically says, "Joy, rejoice!" Right? Behold, Jesus met them, saying, "Rejoice." And so I think this sort of fits in with this same movement that I highlighted earlier, this sort of movement from fear to joy in this passage, at least for the women, right? We never do. Well, I guess we hear more about the guards in the passage that follows this. But at least within this pericope, the guards remain shaken and like dead men. But there is this movement of joy for the women in this passage as they sort of come to grasp the significance of what they've seen and of this resurrection. So as I think about this passage as a whole, again, obviously the main idea is the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and the consequences of that for our world, for our creation, right? But I think what is sort of Matthew's distinctive contribution is to say that God's revelation and the death and resurrection of Jesus is an earth-shaking, revolutionary change, right? I think that image of the earthquake is really significant. That Matthew wants you to know, hey, this is God showing up. This is the theophany. This is God being revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's not, I really probably know theophany is mundane, right? It's always a special event. But this is not even just a normal theophany, right? This is earth shaking. This is earth shattering. This is, I just think Matthew's doing everything he can here to communicate that Jesus' resurrection changes everything, right? And as with many theophanies, that change can be terrifying. And I think that that's a thing we shouldn't lose as we think about this passage, right? It's really easy for us to sort of tame the resurrection and maybe to just focus on that joy exclusively. And we should focus on the joy. I mean, Easter Sunday is Resurrection Sunday is definitely a moment of joy, and we should highlight that. But I think there is a sense in which we shouldn't lose that, hey, like God showing up in this way is actually there's an appropriate amount of terror to that because it represents a really significant change, right? That the way Paul will talk about this is that this inaugurates an entirely new epoch in history, right? A totally new phase in history. I mean, this is why in the Western world our calendar is set from the birth of Jesus, right? We literally record time before the birth of Jesus and after the birth of Jesus, because part of what we're saying is that that's how radically new the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is. It has inaugurated a new epoch, a new era in history. And so, there's a bit of that. Anytime something that changes that substantially, that can be terrifying. Change is hard, right? But Matthew is sort of holding that terror and joy together, that fear and excitement together to say, yes, this is earth-shakingly new, and don't take that lightly. There should be some terror involved in that, and yet ultimately the movement is from terror to joy. That both the angel and Jesus are helping these women move towards seeing the joy of the resurrection, that this means something new and remarkable and good. And of course, that is ultimately the good news, that God's renewal of the creation has begun in the resurrection of Jesus. And Matthew has a really distinctive way of telling that story for us. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful